Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Mariel Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. Hello, and welcome to episode 21. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm having a conversation with Dr. Kelsey Harper, a DBT therapist from Los Angeles who has lots of experience in working with trauma survivors, particularly survivors of sexual assault. Kelsey has created an online community called Warrior Reclamation, which is a space for survivors to find support, connection, and healing. Kelsey and I talk about some of the ways DBT skills can support survivors in their healing journey and some of the ways skills might also be overused or misused. And we also talk about how to deal with triggers from the culture at large. So welcome, Kelsey. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Why don't you start by telling us about your project working with sexual assault survivors?
Well, so I started this community called Warrior Reclamation, and it came actually from a very personal place that I'm a survivor of sexual assault and had noticed during my recovery time just feeling intense isolation, feeling very alone. And in many ways also because of that, feeling like the path of my recovery was just I had to carve it myself in the sense of that, there was just nobody that had gone before me, even though I knew this is something that had happened to many people. And that was very challenging, very difficult. And I think that actually made the recovery process even harder around it, was just feeling so alone and like I'm kind of blindly making my way through this really, really scary forest. And so after I was able to kind of get through my recovery and really get established in my own practice and start to learn more about trauma and trauma recovery and start to provide services, I also started to notice that many of my clients who had also experienced sexual assault and were survivors as well, that they too felt very similarly, that there was this kind of just unknown path around trauma recovery of not even knowing or understanding what symptoms feel really unique to survivors, what the kind of path or journey of recovery looks like, what it means to kind of maintain a survivorship place and still skillfully live. And so this was something that was sitting really heavy with me, especially coming into recent things happening in our political climate, particularly with the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh and just how that was affecting me, how it was affecting a lot of people I knew that were survivors, how it was affecting my clients. And that really prompted me to start to develop and build something that could actually help fill in some of these blanks and meet the needs that are really unique, specific to survivors of sexual assault. And so that's really where it came from, this very personal place that then also is a part of me wanting to give back in many ways too.
And it sounds like it was a pretty isolating experience for you. And then as you started working with folks as a therapist, you heard that echoed in other survivor stories.
Yeah, definitely. Like many people, there's many survivors who walk in my door who don't really even understand what happened to them in a way that's concrete. Like they know that something terrible happened. It really affected them. And it's very scary and it's still something they struggle with. But even using the words sexual assault or rape was very difficult and also left them feeling completely alienated. They didn't know how to talk about it with people and how to seek support. And so there are a lot of survivors that come in and have really sometimes not even an idea that there is a community of people that can be supportive to them and that can actually help them through this and kind of build a community around them in their recovery. But even women who come in, women and men who come in who know what happened to them often feel like they cannot talk about this, that they can't share it with people, that people don't understand. And there is kind of this sense that people who are not survivors don't understand what this is like, which I don't actually think is true. I do think that there is a lot of struggles with people being able to understand and truly validate. We can see that in how they communicate about things, and how we can see, rape culture getting perpetuated in many ways. And on the other side, there are many people who are not survivors who are very understanding and are very capable of being supportive. But it's something that is, I think, unique to the experience of a sexual assault survivor, and also just survivors of trauma, of any trauma really, of feeling very, very isolated. And oftentimes that has a lot to do with also difficulty with feeling safe in general, safe in the body, safe in their world, safe in their relationships. And so that already is very isolating too.
Absolutely. And how, you're a DBT therapist, and this is why I wanted to talk to you. Tell me, what are some of the limitations and maybe also some of the strengths that you see in how DBT approaches trauma survivors?
Yeah, so I'm a DBT therapist. I absolutely love dialectical behavior therapy. I think it really transformed my work with clients, and really transformed, many of my clients' lives as soon as I was able to provide it for them with all of the skills that really help people transforming their lives and being able to really take charge of it, and feel a sense of mastery in their lives. And some of the limits that I noticed that came up, specifically, is when we get into the place of, I refer to it as like maintaining survivorship. It's that, that trauma, especially trauma from sexual assault, is something that we can recover from many of those active symptoms, of flashbacks and hypervigilance and intense anxiety and avoidance or dissociation. But we still are going to have some things that we have to take care of with ourselves in order to stay very grounded and present in the world. And, just on a day-to-day basis, as part of ongoing self-care, that there's going to be now more vulnerabilities, in a survivor's life than there were prior to it. And so sometimes I find that DBT can be a little bit limited in helping people really design a life that feels cohesive, with their values, with the skills, and also with some of those mindfulness. It's like the principles are there, but some of the how-tos of how to move fluidly between all of these things, particularly around some of the value-based work, can be a little limiting. Like particularly survivors have a tendency towards really wanting to work for justice, whether that's for themselves or for others. And that kind of pulls in that build mastery skill and the accumulating positives in the long term. But it doesn't necessarily draw upon, what are some of the risks and the costs to our own personal psyche when we do that kind of thing, and how to, maybe up the ante of the psychological self-care to then be able to mobilize and do some of those social justice and active type of things that survivors want to do as part of their recovery, that is very empowering to them, or creates more of a sense of power and helps them step back into their power. And I also think that sometimes the skills can feel like we're having to step away from some of the quality of the experience and move more towards the quantity, and that's part of DBT, is really measuring like what are things like in a sometimes a very numerical way of like giving a quantifier of like your SUDs are at a 7 out of 10. So therefore you do some self-soothing and distraction. And that can be really powerful and helpful when that's happening. But for many people that feels like it takes some of the meaning out of it. Particularly around, when distress might be a little lower, but it still is painful, and wanting to allow the self to kind of move through some of those emotions and be able to sit with emotions in a way that actually helps healing happen. That healing from trauma requires being able to cope with certain emotions like anger and sadness and grief and fear to kind of bubble up and be processed, and for the body to work through that. And sometimes the skills, either people use the skills as a way of really limiting their exposure to emotion, or as a way of avoiding emotion altogether, and it can actually get in the way of the recovery. And so there are some needs also around skills of being able to like move through and allow the self to live an emotional life as part of the recovery and healing process.
And so interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about how I've also seen sometimes the skills used that way, not specifically thinking about survivors of sexual assault, but in general, folks sometimes going too quickly to opposite action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or the minute their SUDS, subjective units of distress starts rising, and I'll link to a chart of subjective units of distress if folks want to check that out, going right to distress tolerance skills. And you're talking about how there's actually value in healing that can happen with being able to allow some of those emotions to really move through you, even if they don't necessarily fit the facts of the current situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That I think our body, our minds, our hearts, they all really do know how to, from a very instinctual way, how to process and have emotions if we can kind of get out of its way but also don't amplify. And there is a skill for that mindfulness of emotions, although I kind of wish that skill actually was like a whole chapter, because I think there's so much that we can learn in that, of how to be able to sit through emotions and really keep ourselves in that like sweet spot, that zone of we're not cutting them off, but we're also not going to expand them either, and allow that healing to happen.
Can you talk more either from your own personal experience and or from working with folks about how you actually do that? Because so much of DBT, or for people who are drawn to DBT, the appeal can be in part of like, you do this, then you do this, and there's a formula, and that can be very reassuring and containing. And so what you're talking about is a bit more loose, and like,
Mhm.
just be mindful of your current emotion. And when the emotion is really strong, or there's grief or fear, maybe you can give listeners some ideas on how to actually do that.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I agree. That's one of the things that I love about DBT, and I think many people do, is that it creates that sense of safety and security of like, I know what to do, and that's so powerful for survivors as well. To be able to feel like I know what to do. So when I think about being able to sit with an emotion and mindfulness of emotions, there's a couple of things, like some of the examples on the handout, that are really good, that I think are very powerful and grounding. Is first to really notice body sensations, in a very descriptive way, very non-judgmental, without assuming, just describing what the body sensations are. And that can also include things like if your body or body parts have certain urges to take action. Like, you might notice like a sensation feels like my legs want to run, or they want to tense up, or my fists really want to curl even though I'm holding them open. And noticing that and being able to describe that out loud. And there's also a lot of breath work that's important too. And this is helping keep the physiological system really calm and relaxed while the emotions flowing, is to kind of keep the breath long and slow. The other is, incorporating a lot of acceptance, and the mindfulness of emotions talks a little bit about this, with the idea of, quote unquote, learning to love your emotion. And I find that many people find that to be extremely difficult to do. And that's one where I feel like there could actually be so many handouts on how to love an emotion, especially ones that are painful, but with bringing in some acceptance, we can come up with acceptance and dialectical statements that we can say to ourselves in the moments that emotions are happening. That I'm accepting that this is happening. Like, say if it was intense fear, I'm here, I'm afraid, I'm safe, I'm grounded. I'm accepting that fear is here. I can feel it in my body. I accept that fear will come. This is a natural part of being a human. And also saying, like, I also understand that fear is a messenger. And what is fear telling me right now? And in many ways, like, part of loving the emotion can be about going back to when fear has been helpful. Fear has told me things in the past that have been really important. And I know in the future, fear is actually going to operate in a way to keep me safe. And so I'm going to sit here with my partner, and my partner is fear, in this moment, and allow fear to tell me what it needs to say. I'm also going to allow it to pass, and I'm going to be present in my body as I do that. And that can be really, really powerful for staying with the emotion and hanging with it.
It's really beautiful the way you describe it. And I'm thinking,
Thanks. Yeah.
yeah. And I think of like what a lovely kind of expansion or addition to some of the DBT skills that we both really believe in fully and teach to the folks that we work with. This is why you've started the work you have with Warrior Reclamation, because you're wanting to offer something more and to expand on some of the DBT skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, also there are many people who come to DBT from a different direction. Like they come from, chronic emotion dysregulation, feeling like relationships are not working for them and just feeling like their emotions have taken control. And through that process, we find out that trauma has occurred in their past. And then there's times also where people maybe don't come to DBT at all because they don't have these things that have happened in their life that people traditionally would refer them to DBT for. But trauma has happened. And so they don't actually seek out some of these skills-based interventions that can actually be really helpful. And so that's also a part of it, is creating more access. So there are a lot of people that are not getting therapy or are getting different kinds of therapy that don't necessarily involve so much skill-based training or coaching. And so they're able to maybe process some of the trauma, but then they kind of get left with this, well, what now? Like, what am I supposed to do to keep living my life? I have all these emotions, I have all these experiences, and it gets missed in many ways. And in fact, we actually, just anecdotally, my experience has been as many people who actually maybe would qualify more for PTSD are being told that they have like depression or generalized anxiety or just mood instability in general, and aren't actually getting trauma treatment at all, which means they're not getting any of the work that helps them heal from the trauma. They're also not getting any kind of skill for how to cope with symptoms of trauma that come up that increase anxiety, that can lead to depression, that kind of thing. And so part of my work was really about creating access, of like making sure people know, that you're a survivor of sexual assault. There's so much out here that can help you, and we're here, we're ready, we're waiting, and you're welcome at any time that you want to come and take this journey. And that was a huge part of it, was feeling like people really need to know that there are services for them. And that was something I was seeing on one of the Facebook support groups that I'm a part of, was how many people had no idea that there were specific treatments made for trauma recovery, made for, mood stabilizing with emotion regulation, that there were even skills that they could do that would help them be able to live day to day. And DBT was a huge part of that for me, of being able to really regulate my day-to-day emotions and my experiences and create a sense of safety, and being able to offer that to other clients as well. So a huge part of Warrior Reclamation was really like, let's just get the word out that this exists for people, so that they can start their healing journey and start to come back to themselves. And then the other part is a bit of a social justice goal, in a sense of feeling that the world in general, or at least the world around me in general, from what I'm hearing, really doesn't understand or doesn't seem to have enough information about what trauma is, what PTSD looks like. It can look very, very different depending upon everybody's individual experiences and individual constitution and makeup, and particularly what survivors of sexual assault experience, and how that really affects them out in the world, and why certain things are really, really important. That there are people, I think, that genuinely don't know, and therefore end up doing something like minimizing the impact that certain decisions that are made, either by a judge or a court system, by our politicians, and minimizing the effect that it will have on our population of survivors. And given that the statistics are like 1 in 3 women have been sexually assaulted in their lives, 1 in 4 women have survived rape, I actually believe the stats are probably a lot higher than that. But that still is astronomical numbers of people who are affected by sexual assault and rape, that are therefore going to be impacted by decisions made out in the public. So for me, there was also this idea of really needing to educate the masses in a sense of that this is a big deal, this needs attention, and we as a community, as a greater community, can be much more nurturing to people who are survivors, and really look out for each other in that way with the decisions that we make politically, the decisions that we make, in our government, with our judges, with any of these big decisions that are happening, with how our states are handling sexual assault cases, with ending the backlog, while all of these things are so important, and not just a big massive level, but also on an individual level for each individual survivor.
You had said earlier about how the Brett Kavanaugh hearings really were, I don't think you used the word triggering, but I'll use that word, or let's say evocative, and kind of lit a fire under you to do something different and to do something outside of the therapy room. Can you say more about what that experience was like watching those hearings?
Oh yeah. Oh man, it was just, I think it was simultaneously mind boggling and mind blowing, because of the effect that these hearings had on all of the people observing this, and that for me, like I was seeing like this rising up of a lot of survivors, running in to support Dr. Blasey Ford, which I thought was amazing and wonderful. And I think all of us really identified with her, of this person who never asked for this whatsoever, not any part of it, and yet was doing what she thought was the right thing and what other people were telling her was the right thing, in order to speak for the greater good, and putting herself at huge risk to do so. And then on the other side of that were these masses of people coming out, essentially with all these varying different arguments about why it's okay to rape people. And that was like, I just can't wrap my mind around that communication of that. Either it's okay because you're young, or it's okay because, it's not that big of a deal, or it's okay because it's so common, or, and then of course there's the classic of like, well, it doesn't really happen anyways, just the complete denial of it. Or that somebody should be able to hold the most powerful seat that our country has, even though these things have happened in their background, that doesn't disqualify them from making decisions about, our world, our government, our policies, our constitution, and how it's going to be enacted. And in particular, that includes governing women's bodies. And so there is a part of that, there is a lot of that fire that comes from, I think, some very righteous rage of, we have a tiger in our midst right now, and everybody's acting like a tiger is not here. And we need to point that out, and we need to get the tiger out of here. There's a predator in our midst, and we need to neutralize that threat. And then we have all these people being like, it's not a predator, it's not a predator, or it's okay to hang out with predators. And that's so scary and so concerning.
I think about how in our GBT groups, and you probably do this too, we talk about at the beginning of every module the biosocial theory, and we talk about chronic invalidation. And so as you're discussing this, I'm thinking this is continual invalidation of survivors' experience, saying it didn't happen, or it's okay, or don't make such a big deal out of it.
Huge invalidation. And many survivors, like, this was by far not the first time that they've ever heard somebody say that to them, or say that to, their peer group about this. And so most survivors, I would say probably 100% of survivors, have experienced chronic and traumatic invalidation around sexual assault. And at times really reaching that level of gaslighting that can be super damaging too. And that was something that we just saw really bubble up with Brett Kavanaugh and his hearings. And I think one of the things that really sat with me is that, like, one of the only things that have been really supporting me or making me feel motivated through a lot of these things that have been happening in the political climate, including Brett Kavanaugh being one of many of those things, has been that this is telling us where the work needs to be done. that we're pulling up all of the stuff that still needs to change or still needs to be repaired or still needs to actually be pushed out, things that we need to actually take action about that we may have gotten complacent or we may have pushed down towards people who are even more disempowered, to make them just handle it and keep out of the public eye, that this is all coming up now. It's something that's just being more and more revealed. And so that really for me launched into, so therefore I need to do something, that if this is coming up and the message to me is this is showing us where we need to change and what we need to be a part of moving, then I need to make a movement here. And that was part of what launched me then with trying this Warrior Reclamation, was really about wanting to launch a movement or wanting to launch a community that can work towards creating a space that is safe for everybody and does not do this traumatic invalidation, traumatic gaslighting, is nurturing and holding of survivors of trauma, survivors of sexual assault, survivors of rape, and that we have a community that is continuing to work towards really equality and justice, overall in general too.
And that the impact you can have in the therapy room one-on-one or even with groups it's limited. I mean, not to say that it isn't powerful and transformative for the individuals, but you're trying to reach more people.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the one-on-one interventions, they're very powerful and they're just very different, in the sense that you can, with the one-on-one interventions, there's a lot of intensive work that can change the world for this one person. And that's invaluable in many ways. And I do feel very grateful to be a part of that, and very honored to be a part of people's healing journeys, and then there's this other kind of work, the social justice work, the community building work, that's going to intervene in a very different way, in the sense of creating a community, creating an environment that is much more effective, much more validating, much more nurturing, much more safe for people. And ideally, and maybe this is a pie in the sky kind of dream here, would be that we create a community where rape actually stops happening. The goal is so that it never happens again, that this is something that is done.
I love that pie in the sky. I'm all for it. Let's make that a reality.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting because we have a lot of people who are work towards recovery from traumatic things, but not necessarily towards ending traumatic things. And I think that has to be a part of it. And the one-on-one work usually is the recovery from traumatic things. And that's important and invaluable. And then the community work is about continuing that recovery, but also really pushing for, we need to end the traumatic things.
Yeah.
We need to end rape. It just has to happen.
And you recently did a webinar on rape culture, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and describe what rape culture means for listeners who might be unfamiliar with that term.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I just did this webinar on rape culture and social media, and some ideas on how to cope with that in a way that keeps us still active and mobilized in the community. And rape culture is an environment that is reinforcing to sexual assault, violence towards women, and gender-based violence as well, and creates an environment essentially where that is not just permitted, but in some ways encouraged. And a lot of people try to step away from saying that rape culture encourages rape. But what we see is that it actually does. Like, some of the communications that come out is not just saying like, it's okay, we prefer it didn't happen. Some of the communications coming out is saying like, yeah, this should happen. This is a part of life. And so rape culture is very dangerous in that way. And it is that communication, whether directly or passively, that it's okay for people to be in danger of rape, that this is not a problem that we need to solve, that this is just part of life. And we can see it in these very overt ways where you see some of the communication around like the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where they were just like, well, it's kind of okay that he did that. That I think that was one of the weird awakenings that happened, was when there were so many politicians coming out and actually speaking that it really wasn't that bad. And that was super concerning. And that's an overt rape culture message. It's not that bad. It's not a problem. It's okay that this happens. And then the other side is the more covert type kind of things that happen that perpetuate this culture around objectifying and victimizing men and women in a sexual way. And that can be seen sometimes even just in how some of our online dating sites or our dating apps are laid out, like this swipe right and swipe left. We've gotten so used to it that it just feels, natural now that this is how we find a mate. Although I'm guessing it's not the most effective way, but it actually also is reinforcing to this idea. We're very objectifying of people. We're essentially saying, like, I want this, I don't want that, without actually like getting invested in this person as a human. And that's kind of a covert rape culture message. And then some other things, it's like on Instagram, for example, women understand some of the rules about what they're allowed to post about their bodies, and what they're not allowed to post about their bodies. Some of them are very, very clear, basic rules that are imposed that are very sexist in their nature. But other times there's things like women are not allowed to post a picture about their bodies when they feel confident about it, but they have to post, if they do, they have to talk about something else that's happening in the picture. And then the comment section will be a lot of people attacking her, assuming things about her sexuality, making sexual comments to her, making violent threats, all of these things. And really, she's just like smiling in front of a bouquet of flowers. And that's what rape culture looks like. It's very harmful. It really communicates to women that we live in an extremely dangerous world. And it communicates to men that it's okay for the world to be dangerous, that it's okay for them to do dangerous things. And so some of the skills that I talked about, I kind of came up with these three main themes of skill sets that I think are very valuable for helping get through rape culture as we experience it in social media, when we're reading the comment section of certain things, when somebody posts, some article. I think one of my earliest experiences of rape culture was when Cosmopolitan magazine published an article about sexual assault. And then in the article put like this little special kind of discussion about what they called gray area rape. And it was essentially saying, like, when is rape not rape, and when women are falsely accusing men, which is very rape culture-y.
Wow.
Is saying that women falsely accuse men of rape all the time, and we need to be suspicious of this. This is wildly not true, wildly inaccurate. Like this, the numbers and the statistics of false accusations of rape are even lower than false accusations of other crimes. So we know categorically this is not true. But people continue to perpetuate that narrative that this is something that happens. And really all it is it's a mechanism for us to continue to not believe survivors of sexual assault when they come forward.
Yeah, it's a way of silencing.
Yeah, very much so. And so the skills that I came up with were these main sets were and they relate directly to some DBT skills, to other types of modalities and those skills too. And the first being centeredness, of finding a center. This is like similar to mindfulness, of having to get grounded, being able to be in the space that you're in, being able to feel yourself, pull everything back. Many times when survivors experience, traumatic invalidation or gaslighting, they dissociate, as many people do as well as survivors. And so getting back grounded is really key and important, being able to recognize where you are, what's going on in your body, so that you can act effectively. And then the next thing is to move into how to take care of yourself and self-care. And I break that down into two pieces, which is balancing vulnerabilities, like in DBT, where it's looking at, like, do I have to eat something? Do I have to sleep? Am I tired? Do I feel like I really need to just actually take care of myself by myself right now and focus on that, versus being able to push for change, which is when we can kind of mobilize and get active in things. So in a sense, it's looking at, once we get centered, we can look at, what are the needs here? Do I have needs that need to be attended to first? Or can I launch into some sort of action? And I talk about what the signs of those are. And then the third set of skills is about building and connecting to community. That it's really, really key, especially when invalidation and gaslighting happen, that we can connect to those validating individuals, because those are the ones that remind us of the truth and the reality of situations, help us stay centered and grounded, help us not feel so alone, and actually help us stay regulated. Validation is one of the most powerful skills for staying regulated. And so being able to connect to community helps us get that validating experience, but it also helps amplify much of our power in mobilizing and taking action. And many times when we feel gaslighted or invalidated about these topics, we do feel an urge to speak out. That's a very natural thing to feel. There's an injustice occurring. We need to respond back. And it's about how to do that in a way that still is taking care of you and maybe can even amplify that message a little further. And so that's what I cover in that webinar. And that occurred, I think, about 2 weeks ago. And so I have a link that I send out to people when they request it from me when they join my newsletter.
I guess I don't know if you have got to this point, Kelsey, in your work yet. I guess I want to know, like, can people do individual coaching, or what your other offerings are?
Yeah, so with Warrior Reclamation right now, it's just a community. I send out newsletters every week, usually once or twice a week. I do a webinar that's free that people can be a part of, where I talk about some of these topics and these skills. I do have another webinar coming up in November that's going to be about internalized gaslighting and intuition. And I'm doing it with a good colleague, Abby Thompson, who does a lot of good work with intuition and building intuition skills. And that's where things are right now. I do offer group-based coaching, and it's something that's accessible to people virtually as well, that we would do video conferencing, joining a social networking site that's just for survivors that are a part of the coaching group, so that they can connect with each other, discuss the different skills and all of that. I have two offers specifically for survivors, and then I have another offer of group coaching for mental health professionals that work with survivors. Because if we believe the statistics to truly be 1 in 3, as opposed to maybe higher than that, but even if it is higher than that, we know that there are therapists and mental health professionals that are also survivors, and wanting to reach out to them and also give them a lot of skills on how to take care of themselves while they do this very important work with survivors.
That's great. I don't think I was aware of that portion of your work and how useful that is, because so many therapists, yes, are survivors themselves. Just given the numbers, of course, that would be the case. And so how to take care of yourself while you're doing this deep healing work with others, that's so valuable.
Yeah, it's something, we see with other professionals. There can be what we call vicarious trauma, which is, getting burnt out and feeling like taking on a lot of the secondary traumatic experiences or traumatic symptoms of their clients. But we also have therapists that are survivors of sexual assault, survivors of trauma themselves. And that can kind of compound it in a very complex way. And many of these therapists, as any mental health professional, I believe one of the assumptions I hold is that we're all here because we really want to help people, and that we really do find a lot of meaning in providing service to others and providing this healing work. And it can be really, really disheartening to get to a place where it feels like that work can actually be threatening or harmful. And so the group coaching is about how to set up self-care around a lot of that in a very deep way that's specific to the needs of people who are survivors of trauma, and providing services to survivors of trauma.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Kelsey. And can you say the name of your website and where people can find you on social media?